Hello again, I'm back, and this is the lecture Evolutionary, Biology, and Creationism. Now let me remind you again, I have my own point of view and my own biases, and you are not required to agree with me. All I want you to do is I want you to understand what I'm saying, understand my arguments, and you are it's perfectly acceptable in your personal essays if you take another tack, if you disagree with me directly, or if you just want to write about it from a different point of view than the one that I have. So, this lecture, in this lecture I talk a lot about religion. I am not an expert on religion. I'm not a scholar of religion. In preparation to teach this course, I did read a lot of religion scholars. I read religion history, I read religion psychology, I read religion anthropology, and I read a lot of what I guess would be called religious writing. Maybe there's a word for it, but it's gone out of my head now. So, we're talking about the theory of evolution versus an alternative, or several alternative ways of looking at the history of life. And in order that you would not have to get all your information filtered through my way of looking at things, I've assigned you to be exposed directly to the words and thoughts of the creationists. I have assigned you to read 3 essays by 3 of the most prominent intelligent design people. These are smart people, some of them have advanced degrees, and they are not some hit just come in from the forest. You have to really read what they have to say and consider it. I've assigned you to watch a documentary, Unlocking the Mystery of Life, which is a documentary made by and for the people in the intelligent design movement, and they tell you as clearly and forcefully as they can what their positions are. And of course I'll be interacting with you via email, specifically about your essays, but just in general, and if you have something to say or comment or ask, we will take up whatever topic you want to take. So let's talk first about the religious objection, looked at from the point of view of the year 2020, the religious objection to the theory of evolution. Now, something I said earlier in the course bears repeating here, and in fact it bears repeating several times in this and the next lecture. And that is that not everyone who is religious rejects the theory of evolution. In fact, if you look at the official churches in Christianity, a majority of Christians are members of denominations that accept or endorse the theory. For example, if you look at the websites of, say, for example, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the United Church of Christ, the Lutheran Church, a scholar has looked at all the websites and all the statements about which denominations endorse the theory, the scientific theory, and which denominations reject it. And this scholar came to the conclusion that 77% of American Christians belong to denominations that either accept the theory of evolution or endorse the theory of evolution. Now, of course, many people in those denominations have no idea what their official church does, and it may be that they disagree with their official church teaching on this matter, but that's not the point. The point I'm making here is that we often have an argument in which there are two choices. Either you're religious and you reject the theory of evolution, or you're an atheist and you accept the theory of evolution. That's a very misleading way to categorize things. There are not just two choices. There are, as we'll get into a little later, there are famous scientists who are religious, famous biologists who are religious. There are people who study religion and advance the thinking about religion, theologians. I believe theologians was the word I couldn't bring up earlier. There are theologians who not only accept but enthusiastically endorse the theory of evolution. So, let us not fall into the trap of thinking that there's an either-or choice here. You're pro-evolution, you're anti-religion. Not so. There are other choices. So, among those minority of Christian denominations who reject the theory of evolution, those are almost universally the denominations that endorse what is called the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. And that's a fancy way of saying they believe and they teach that every single word of both the Old and the New Testament is a literal, true description of reality. It's true as history, it's true as psychology, it's true as physics, it's true as chemistry, it's true as biology. Every word, literally true. That is the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. And some of the people who believe this, and of course there are many, many different nuances to this belief, but some of the people who endorse this idea believe that God himself, and those who believe this all believe that God is a him, they believe that God himself actually wrote the Bible. Others argue that God directly inspired people to write the Bible. That is, God told people what to write and they wrote it down. Other people say, no, God was not directly involved, but the stories in the Bible are literally true anyway for various reasons that they give. When we're talking about this area, we have to get some of our words straight, what they mean. I've already told you what a fundamentalist is. Fundamentalist is someone who believes in biblical inerrancy. That is, every word of the Bible is literally true. An evangelical Christian, is someone who is a Protestant Christian, that is, not a Catholic Christian, who has been personally born again, that is, who has had a personal awakening of some sort and feels as though he or she has become in some ways a different person from having accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. Undoubtedly, I mean, I don't have a count on this, but undoubtedly, the majority of evangelicals are fundamentalists, but not all of them. Jimmy Carter, for example, former president Jimmy Carter, he's an evangelical Christian, but he's not a fundamentalist. So not all evangelicals are fundamentalists, although most of them are, but pretty much all fundamentalists are evangelicals. Together, if you said the evangelical community and the fundamentalist community, they are what we generally call the conservative Christian community. I'm not sure that conservative is the right word, but that's the word that one encounters in the media and in scholarship. So, there is now a history of the fundamentalist encounter, not just with Darwin, but with much of the rest of the development of society over the past, say, 200 years. And we're going to, the word that's often given to the way society is now, and the way it's developing, and the way it's, dare I use the word, evolving, is modernism. We are in a modernist era. And modernism is the fundamentalists' enemy. So let's talk a little about what modernism is. You talk to 100 scholars, you'll probably get 50 different theories about what modernism is. Here's the way I understand modernism. I understand modernism as a large-scale secularization of society. That is, society for several hundred years, and in the West, and by the West I mean Western Europe and North America, basically, society has been becoming less and less saturated with religious belief and religious feelings. If you go back 800 years, say, into Western Europe, of course there's no Western European presence in North America 800 years ago. You go back before the 15th century, basically all European society is religious. That is, there's no separate thinking about economics. All economic thinking comes from religious people who argue about such questions as, what is the just price? There's no separate thinking about politics. All political discussion is discussion about how should we interpret the Bible so as to tell politicians how to behave. There's no separate field that is recognized as science. People who studied plants and animals and the stars back then were called natural philosophers. And they had to be very careful not to put out theories which contradicted things in the Bible. They would always start, whenever they wrote a book or something, they would start by saying, here is my interpretation of the glories of God as revealed through flowers. Something like that. So, we start 800 years ago. There is no non-religious thinking. Starting in the 16th century, there begins to be a secularization of thinking among people who think. And it starts in a number of ways. One of the ways it starts with Copernicus in 1543, I think, publishing a book in which he says the Earth is not the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth orbits the sun. And we get, it's possible to write many books on the way modernism advances, that is, the ongoing secularization of society. Machiavelli in the 17th century, I think, 17th century, writes a book, The Prince. And it's not that the book, The Prince, it tells you exactly how to govern or what its importance is that it's the first secular discussion of politics in Western European history. Machiavelli says, I want to unite Italy. Italy's a bunch of quarreling principalities. I think we need one country, and here's how we go about it. This is how successful politicians behave. He does not once in The Prince does he say, this is what the Bible says we should do, so let's do that. It's a secular book. That's why it's important. So let me define secular for you. It means non-religious or independent of religious influence. Doesn't mean anti-religious, although religious people often interpret non-religious thinking as anti-religious thinking. But it's not necessarily that way. Well, in politics, as we move towards the present, church and state, religion and politics, begin to move apart, become separate things. And the United States Constitution creates, 1787, creates the first polity in the history of the world that is a secular government, deliberately a secular government. Now, when the Constitution was put up for vote, there were people who objected to the Constitution for a variety of reasons. They were called the Anti-Federalists. And one of the arguments made by the Anti-Federalists was, we should reject this Constitution because it does not create a Christian country. But the Constitution was passed. And the Constitution, among other things, it's the first government document in the history of the world, so far as I know. It says in it, we will not allow any religious tests for people who want to serve in public office. The religion of people who serve in public office is their own private business. It's not any business of other government magistrates. And then we have the First Amendment in 1791, which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There's been a lot of discussion over the decades, over the centuries, about what an establishment of religion is. Of course, people have their own opinions. But in general, no establishment of religion means the state does not support any particular denomination with tax money. The head of the government of the United States is not the head of any church, not the head of any official church. Members of minority denominations, Jews for example, can't be made to pay any sort of special taxes or have special laws applied to them just because they're not Jews. All the laws apply to everybody. All the taxes that are paid on the basis of economic criteria, not religious criteria. The 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, basically applies these rules to the states. First Amendment applied just to the United States of America. The 14th Amendment now says, well, these rules also apply to the states. Now, of course, there have been suits and countersuits and charges and countercharges, and some people have been appointed to the Supreme Court, and then other people have been, and so we now have a long, complicated constitutional jurisprudence of the relationship of church and state. But as I said in the previous lecture, the basic fundamental principle behind our constitutional jurisprudence is that government and government institutions such as the public schools are secular, not religious. Now let's specifically focus in on science and what science does to the religious worldview. Copernicus in 1543 removes the Earth from the center of the universe. Scientists after that begin to decide that they can do their work and they can discover things about nature without including any sort of religious assumptions. Laplace was a French astronomer. He wrote a very influential book in 1805 about the solar system. He presented this book to Napoleon, who was then governing France. I'm reading from a history. Someone had told Napoleon that the book contained no mention of the name of God. Napoleon, who was fond of putting embarrassing questions, received it with the remark, "Monsieur Laplace, they tell me you have written this large book on the system of the universe and have never even mentioned its creator." Laplace drew himself up and answered bluntly, in French of course, "I had no need of that hypothesis." Now, notice, Laplace is not saying God doesn't exist. He doesn't say, "I'm not religious." He doesn't say, "All of you people in France should stop being religious." He says, "I can do science without bringing in supernatural assumptions." And from then on, that's basically what scientists do. They try to explain nature without bringing in assumptions about supernatural causation. Now, science, there's a whole field of philosophy of science. I have an entire shelf in my home library, philosophy of science, and I've read a whole bunch about this sort of subject. But one of the things that seems pretty clear to me is that science must have a secular methodology. That is because the explanation, God did it, is not an explanation at all. When you say God did it, what you are doing is saying, I can't explain this, I'm going to stop trying to. So when you say to someone, as the creationists say to evolutionary biologists, Darwin's theory is wrong, God did it. What that's basically saying is, we don't have an explanation, but we're going to pretend that we do. As you recall, because you've read it, Darwin has one sentence in his book in which he concedes that because he can't explain how the first self-replicating molecule came about, it's possible that that self-replicating molecule was created by a supernatural creator. Darwin says, essentially in his book, I can explain everything after that. But the principle still applies. To say God created it is not really an explanation. It's just an admittance that you can't explain it. So, modernism is a term used by scholars to refer to the era in the history of Europe and North America since about somewhere in the 19th century. You might, if you want, start modernism with Copernicus. Maybe you can start it with Machiavelli. Maybe you can start it with the US Constitution. Maybe you can start it with Darwin. But at any rate, by the time we get to the 20th century, it's clear that modernism is remaking society at its roots. So about the 1920s, I'm skipping over some history here, about the 1920s, fundamentalist Christians, especially but not exclusively in the American South, began to develop a critique of modernism. And they don't call it modernism. They call this tendency in society to take explanation and take life out of the religious sphere. They call it secular humanism. Secular humanism. Secular humanism is the fundamentalists' catch-all term for all the things they don't like about modernism and all the consequences they don't like of modernism. So here, modernism, by the way, is not just a sort of disembodied tendency in society. It's actually a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy of secular-minded people to take religious truth out of society. And there are, of course, therefore, some fundamentalists who will say that it is a conspiracy directed by Satan. Not all say that, but some do. So here's an article in the Christian Harvest Times from 1980. Well, to understand humanism is to understand women's liberation, the Equal Rights Amendment, gay rights, children's rights, abortion, sex education, the new morality, evolution, values clarification, situational ethics, the separation of church and state, the loss of patriotism, and many of the other problems that are tearing America apart today, unquote. You see, evolution is not just one thing. It's not even the most important thing. It's a part of this huge swirling tendency that's also a conspiracy to undermine religion. Not everyone who objects to the theory of evolution buys into this humanist conspiracy idea, but millions of people do. So let's, I've talked a little bit about the courts. Now I'm going to go into more detail about more court decisions. So we talked about Engel versus Vitale. 1962, court says it's unconstitutional to require prayers in public schools. Abington School District versus Shemp, 1963. Supreme Court says reading the Bible over the school intercom is unconstitutional. Then in 1971, we get Lemon versus Kurtzman and the three-part Lemon test to try to explain to people what's constitutional and what isn't. I went over that in the previous lecture. There's a whole series leading up to quite recently. Another one is Stone versus Graham in 1980. It's unconstitutional to post a copy of the Ten Commandments in school. Now, fundamentalists see this history of secularizing decisions by the Supreme Court, and they say that the Supreme Court is part of the satanic conspiracy. But so is science. I'm not going to talk so much about the strategy that fundamentalists use to try to change court rulings. But they also adopt a strategy, starting in 1960, to try to change modern science. Perhaps it's a little more truthful to say they adopt a strategy to create a counter science, a different science based upon religious assumptions, using religion's methods, which is nevertheless a true science. The science that really tells you how everything got here, as opposed to the satanic science that stems from Darwin. The first effort to make a creationist science was the book, The Genesis Flood, that was written by John Whitcomb and Henry Morris in 1961. The theory from the Genesis flood is all the fossils and other evidence of extinct organisms are the result of the 40-day flood of Noah described in Genesis. Now, you remember Stephen Jay Gould's essay, The Freezing of Noah. He says that Buckland starts out with this theory, in I think it's the 1820s, that fossils can be explained in terms of Noah's flood. And what Gould says is that Buckland was an honest scientist because he looks at the evidence and finally he publicly admits that the evidence contradicts his theory. It is not Noah's flood. We're talking about fossils that were laid down not in one 40-day period, but over immense distances of time. Nevertheless, the Genesis flood brings the Noah flood theory back to say that Noah's flood explains everything we see in terms of fossils. And it says, this is on page 87, all land animals in the world today have descended from those which were in the ark. Yes, this contradicts all modern paleontology, geology, physics, everything else. But pages 43 and 343, they say scientific dating methods are wrong. They don't work, they're unreliable. Scientists are wrong about everything else too, all their theories, physics, chemistry, geology, they're all wrong. But especially the theory of evolution is wrong. And at the end of the book they say, it is, quote, is quite plain that the processes used by God in creation were utterly different from the processes which now operate in the universe, unquote. That's page 223. Well, that sentence, of course, gives the game away. They're saying that all the evidence that we have accumulated in the scientific revolution since 1543, it's all wrong. All the methods are wrong. People have misunderstood all the everything they've seen. What's right is Genesis. So they say on page 473. Yes, I read the whole book. Page 473. We must accept either the current theories of paleontology with an inconceivably vast time scale for fossils before the appearance of man on Earth, or we must accept the order of events as set forth so clearly in the Word of God, unquote. That is, Genesis. Now, that's basically, they're throwing up their hands and they're saying, we can't do it. We can't create a counter science. But that's not the end of creationist science. That's the beginning. Since the Genesis flood was published, many smart people have tried to create a counter science. In my last lecture, I held up to the camera 3 books of that type. They try to do several things. One is they try to disprove Darwin's theory of evolution. I should say, they try to disprove the Darwin-Mendel theory of evolution. The best of these books is probably a book by an actual chemist, Australian chemist, named Michael Denton, 1986. It's Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And he's a chemist who tries to show that chemistry proves the theory of evolution wrong. He was a molecular biologist, and he argued that the biochemical evidence did not support the theory that all animals are related to one another, that they all go back to a common ancestor. Secondly, some other people try to prove that the creationist account in Genesis is supported by the evidence. We talked about that. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of websites dedicated to disproving the theory of evolution or showing that it results in most of the bad things that have happened in the world since 1859, including both Hitler and Stalin. If you go to YouTube after this lecture is over, or right now, and you type in Darwin's Deadly Legacy, that's YouTube, Darwin's Deadly Legacy, you will see a representative attack on the theory of evolution. So let's go back to the courts now. In 1968, the Arkansas legislature passed a law making it a crime to teach in a public school that humans have descended from a lower order of animals. This case quickly goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Epperson versus Arkansas in 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously holds that the Arkansas law violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. It says it violates the First Amendment by embodying a specific religious belief and prohibiting others. The court also holds in Epperson versus Arkansas that the state's power to determine the public school's curriculum did not include the authority to ban the teaching of established scientific theory simply because it conflicted with a particular religious doctrine. Of course, if you're interested in this, if you're thinking about going to law school someday, you can go online. Epperson versus Arkansas is online, word for word. You can read the whole thing. In 1981, the Louisiana legislature passed a law mandating that if either the theory of evolution or creationism was taught in public schools, then both had to be taught. This law goes to the Supreme Court too. In 1987, in Edwards versus Aguilar, the Supreme Court held to 7-2 that the law was unconstitutional. The court majority held that the purpose of the law was to discredit a scientific theory by making it appear that creationism had equal scientific standing. I'm quoting from the Supreme Court's decision. The preeminent purpose of the Louisiana legislature was clearly to advance the religious viewpoint that a supernatural being created humankind, unquote. So we have those two Supreme Court decisions. In 2004, in the township of Dover, Pennsylvania, the school board adopted a policy for the public schools that in 9th grade biology classes, this is the grade at which the students had been introduced to the theory of evolution. Before the class started, teachers were to read a statement warning the students that the theory was controversial and that there were available alternatives, including the theory of intelligent design. Some parents immediately sued the school board. This case, at Tammy Kitzmiller et al. Versus Dover Area School District, it didn't go to the Supreme Court, it went to a federal court, and that decision came down. Judge Jones, by the way, Judge Jones, who rendered this decision, was a Republican. He'd been appointed by the Republican President George W. Bush. He said clearly this policy was unconstitutional. He said intelligent design is a religious, not a scientific doctrine. It is creationism under another name. He said the criticisms of the theory of natural selection by intelligent design had been refuted by the scientific community. One of the things that the intelligent design people had been doing in defense of this policy was saying that they weren't trying to teach a specific doctrine, they were just trying to teach the controversy. That is, they wanted to do what I'm doing in this class. They wanted people in public schools to get both sides of the controversy and then make up their own minds. This is what Judge Jones wrote about this ID strategy. This tactic is at best disingenuous and at worst a canard. The goal of the ID movement is not to encourage critical thought, but to foment a revolution which would supplant evolutionary theory with intelligent design. Unquote. Therefore, ruled Judge Jones, the school board has to rescind its policy. Now, as it happened, this decision came out in January of 2005. In early December of 2004, there had been an election in Dover, and in which a slate of pro-science people had run against the people on the school board who had adopted the original policy. All 8 of them won. That is, all 8 of the pro-science people defeated all 8 of the ID people. And so by the time Judge Jones rendered his verdict, the policy had already been rescinded and Dover was back to teaching evolution in the schools. Nevertheless, there was Judge Jones. We have his decision, and once again, you can go online if you want to. It's on there. Well, despite all of this, all these court decisions, every year there are efforts by people in state legislatures to legalize the teaching of creationism or to get schools to teach the controversy or something. You could go on and get a whole bunch of them. I have a bunch of them here. I'm not going to read them for you. I have one from Kentucky. I have another one from Missouri. I've already read you some stuff from Texas, and so forth. And let's focus in then specifically on public schools in Texas. The Texas State Board of Education, SBOE, Texas State Board of Education, is a state agency that's charged with overseeing the 1,000 plus school districts in Texas. Until 2011, it decided what textbooks all the students, all the school districts could use. It makes lists of requirements that the textbooks must satisfy. That is, if it's an American history textbook, one of the things you have to talk about is the philosophical theory behind the Declaration of Independence, that sort of thing. In 2011, the legislature took away the SBOE's authority to say, here is a list of books from which you must choose in history, in biology. So now the State Board of Education can only make a list of books it recommends. If a school district wants to choose a textbook from outside that list, now it's legal for them to do so. The State Board of Education is 15 members who are elected from districts. State is divided into 15 districts. Each district sends one member to the State Board of Education. If you want to, you can go online, you can put into Google Texas State Board of Education election district, and up will come a map of Texas with the lines drawn for the 15 districts. Since about 1994, Republicans have had a majority, somewhere between 8 or 7, 8, 9, a majority would be 8 or 9 of the 15 on the State Board of Education. But the Republicans have been split between economic Republicans, business Republicans, who are, in general, pro-evolution, and social conservatives, who are often young earth conservatives and utterly opposed to teaching a scientific theory in class. The way things work, when the new biology textbooks are up for debate, often the economic conservative Republicans will vote with the Democrats and thus defeat some of the things that the social conservatives want to do on the State Board of Education. Now, one of the documentaries that I was going to show you in class is entitled The Revisionaries. And The Revisionaries is about the struggle on the State Board of Education in 2009 and 2010 over what biology textbooks are going to be required for Texas schools. It's a fascinating documentary. I recommend it, although I'm not saying you have to watch it. If you went to school in Texas, you may want to look at it and see what kind of people are making rules for your education. All right, let's talk a little, hone in now specifically on intelligent design. Intelligent design is the doctrine now that not a creator, but an intelligent designer is responsible for all the life we see around us. Grass, orangutans, humans, sperm whales, everything has been designed by an intelligent designer. As I say, it is centered on the Discovery Institute in Seattle. The main goal of the Discovery Institute is to persuade the public schools, through the State Board of Education, through state legislatures, whatever, persuade public schools to teach the controversy about the adequacy of Darwinist, Mendelist theory as an explanation for how everything got here. The ID people make several arguments, some of which are quite clever. Number one, they attack scientific biology, theory of evolution, as an inadequate explanation for how everything got here. They make the argument, with which you're now familiar, that there are not enough intermediate fossils to support the theory. They also make a very interesting argument which has attracted a lot of attention, called the irreducible complexity argument. I'm going to define that. Something is irreducibly complex if it is a system of functional parts which will fail to function if any one part is missing. An analogy, a metaphor that's often used is a mousetrap. A mousetrap is a beautifully functioning little machine. But if you take any one part away from it, it won't function. If you take the spring away from a mousetrap, it's useless. Therefore, the mousetrap is irreducibly complex. The argument is that an irreducibly complex system cannot have evolved because it would not function until the whole system was in place. Therefore, there cannot have been intermediate steps in which the system was adaptive. It had to have been put together as it is, fully formed. Evolution can't do that, runs the argument. Only, therefore, an intelligent designer must have done it. Now, the most famous person to come up with irreducible complexity is an actual chemist at Lehigh University, biochemist, named Michael Behe, B-E-H-E. I have assigned you an essay by Michael Behe. He's a smart guy. He's no fool. His argument is basically, what good is half a molecule? Or what good is half a protein? All these incredibly complicated systems we have in, say, the human body. The immune system, for example, extremely complicated. They are irreducibly complex, meaning they would not function unless the whole system was put into place at one time. If they would not function unless the whole system was put into place at one time, then they cannot have evolved. They must have gotten there in some other way. Now, this argument should remind you of some previous argument we have heard about Darwin's theory. Think back, think back. Who was it who made this kind of an argument earlier? Have you got it? You want to pause? No. It was St. George Mivart in 1871. Remember, Mivart says, what good is half a wing? The intermediate stages of a wing would be non-adaptive, so they can't have evolved. Somehow that chicken must have been made with fully functional wings, or it would not have survived. Therefore, chickens cannot have evolved. Mivart, what good is half a wing? Behe, what good is half a protein? It's essentially the same argument, but it's more sophisticated. It's made at the molecular level. So, here's Behe. Since natural selection can only choose systems that are already working, then if a biological system cannot be produced gradually, it would have to arise as an integrated unit in one fell swoop. Where's the word? For natural selection to have anything to act on. So go read Behe's argument. Another argument that's often made by intelligent design people is associated with a fellow named William Dembski. He claims that natural processes cannot assemble systems of information. Only an intelligent power can create more information than there was before. I have assigned you to read an essay by William Dembski. I warn you, Michael B., he is a relatively clear, organized writer. William Dembski is dense and hard to read, but I'm giving you a summary of his argument here. Neither algorithms nor natural laws are capable of producing information. The great myth of modern evolutionary biology is that information can be gotten on the cheap without recourse to intelligence. So, since DNA is information, and since DNA makes our chromosomes and genes, and information cannot have been made without intelligent design, therefore intelligent design explains everything. ID people make a third argument, which is that scientists have never observed the birth of a new species in the lab, nor created one in the lab. Here's one from Philip Johnson. I've assigned you to read part of Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial. Quote, "Scientists cannot observe complex biological structures being created by random mutations and selection in a laboratory or elsewhere." Okay. Those are essentially negative arguments. That is, those are arguments in which intelligent design people are saying, this is why evolutionary biology fails. But they also make some positive arguments. That is, here is why we can infer that an intelligent designer, not a creator, but an intelligent designer designed everything here. They try to make the positive case that the evidence, when properly interpreted, shows that an intelligent designer created the many species of organisms we see today. And Michael Dembski argues that, how shall I put this simply, more simply than he does? He says essentially that all biological systems are extraordinarily improbable. That is, the odds that any one organism, or even a system of an organism, a mouse's immune system, that any of those could have come into come into reality, come into existence by random mutation is so fantastically small that it essentially is impossible. The only way that these complex mutations, complex series of coordinated mutations, can have come about is if somebody was telling them what to do. In that article, Michael Dembski talks about the concept of specificity, which I think is very difficult to understand. And I've read his explanation several times, and I think it's difficult to understand because he's making a trick. What it is basically circular reasoning. He's saying a specified system is a design system. A design system is a specified system. Therefore, Darwin's wrong and I'm right. That's bad reasoning, and it's hard to figure out the bad reasoning because he's such an obscure writer. Judge for yourself. Another argument that Philip Johnson makes, especially in his book, is that orthodox science is based on naturalism, Real science should permit the appeal to supernatural forces and entities. Here's the definition of naturalism. It's the avoiding of magical, unmeasurable forces and entities in the investigation of nature. It's one of the methodological foundations of modern science. Johnson argues that naturalism is a metaphysical assumption. It's no better than any assumption. It's no better than supernatural assumptions. He says, quote, "Some readers may wonder why the scientists won't admit that there are mysteries beyond our comprehension, and that one of them, that there are mysteries beyond our comprehension, and that one of them may be how these complex animal groups could have evolved directly from pre-existing bacteria and algae without leaving any evidence of the transition. The reason that such an admission is out of the question is that it would open the door to creationism." He wrote this before he and the people who agree with him had gone from creationists to intelligent designers. So, read Behe, read Dembski, read Johnson, and the people who criticize them. See what you think. Now, here's my take on intelligent design. First point is that intelligent designers insist. What they're talking about is not God. This intelligent designer is not God. Let's look at that claim first. If the designer has been designing all the life on Earth, then the designer must go back 3.7 billion years. I might point out, I didn't say this, but I have to say it. Intelligent design people accept that life has evolved. Now, Michael Behe says over and over that it's true, life has evolved, it's 3.7 billion years old, and it's evolved through mutation. What Behe and the others insist on is that these mutations cannot have been random. They must have been directed. That is, something, somebody, some force from outside must have come into the DNA of the snail and fiddled with the DNA so that the right changes occurred in the DNA so that the snail evolved into a better snail. Okay. If that's true, if that's responsible for life, then the designer must have been around for at least 3.7 billion years. So, to all intents and purposes, therefore, the designer is immortal. Also, everyone admits that you can't see the designer at work. You can't actually see a designer fiddling with chromosomes. Therefore, the designer is invisible. The designer has to be able to see into the reproductive cells of billions of individual organisms. Worms, oak trees, sponges, fungi, bacteria, humans, fish. Therefore, the designer is omniscient, which means you can see everything. The designer can reach into the DNA of all these creatures and cause a series of mutations that will cause the creatures to evolve in a certain way. Therefore, the designer is omnipotent. This is not part of the actual logic, but having read all these guys over and over again, I can tell you that they think that the goal of all of this design is humans. The designer wanted humans to evolve eventually. Therefore, the designer is benign. Now, folks, what do we call an entity that is invisible, immortal, omniscient, omnipotent, and benign? Well, despite their insistence that they're not doing anything religious, ID people just sometimes can't resist. Here's something that, who is it? Here's William Dembski. Quote, within Christianity, God has traditionally been revealed in two books. The book of Scripture, which is the Bible, and the book of nature, which is creation. Both books testify to the God who is their common author. Much of the confusion in science and theology these days results from severing these two books. When Christ is the lens through which we survey the world and the various disciplines that try to understand the world, we should expect the Christological lens to focus on Christ as well. The point to understand here is that Christ is never an addendum to scientific theory, but always a completion. That's Dembski. Here's Philip Johnson. My primary goal in writing Darwin on Trial was to legitimate the assertion of a theistic worldview in the secular universities. Theistic means we believe in God and a God who intervenes in daily life. Philip Johnson, in a speech in 2001 explaining why he helped found the ID movement, was so that the people of God will have an opportunity to work together for a common result. So, I think it is an attempt at deception for ID people to claim that they are not creationists and that the intelligent designer is not some form of a Christian God. Why are they doing this? Why are they insisting that their goal is really secular science or non-secular science? It's because of the court decisions. They know that they can't have an influence on what children are taught in school if they are honest about their goals. So they're dishonest about their goals, and they would just say that sometimes you have to fight a war by being deceptive. They wouldn't say that to you, of course, and they especially wouldn't say it to me. Well, I want to say one more thing about intelligent design and whether it's scientific and all that sort of thing. It's really pretty simple, in my view. All the intelligent design people have to do is come up with a designometer, or if you prefer, a designometer. That is, all they have to do is come up with a device that measures the design force. But what you say, I mean, by definition, you can't have that. Not so. Scientists have come up with many inventions over the years to measure things that human senses cannot detect. For example, a Geiger counter. Geiger counter measures radioactive energy. I mean, I've never held a Geiger counter, but I've seen plenty of Geiger counters on movies and television. And you turn it on and there's just a little bit of background radiation and it goes click, click, click. And then you put it next to your watch and it goes click, 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 click. It's a Geiger counter. Our senses, our human senses, cannot detect that radioactivity. But Mr. Geiger, Professor Geiger, invented this thing. And now we can measure radioactivity. EMF meters. Human senses cannot detect electromagnetic fields. But now we've invented these devices. Electromagnetic field meters that can detect electromagnetic fields. A spectrometer. We cannot detect various wavelengths of light except in a very general sense, in that we say this color and that color, and look, there's a rainbow and it goes from violet to red. But a spectrometer can very precisely measure the various wavelengths of light. So there's 3 examples of where a scientist invented a device to measure something which humans could not see or hear or smell or taste or touch themselves. And now we can measure those things very precisely. Okay, well then let the ID people do it with their design force. Let them invent a designometer, something that will allow us to measure the design force. The instant they do that, they will become scientific. And by the way, whoever does it will win a Nobel Prize. So, here is my advice to the intelligent design people. If you're right, all you have to do is invent a designometer, and then all the rest of us will have to admit that you've been correct in your science all along.